All right, hello and welcome to lesson 3 of Last Epoch University. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about loot, one of the best parts of an ARPG. Where are you getting your gear from? How are you getting it? What's the best stuff? What's not so good? All of those important questions. We're generally going to go through at the basic level, what all that means, so you know what you're looking at when something drops in the world. Let's start with gear slots. So what areas of your character can you actually put gear into? You know, what kind of things are going to drop? So every character can have the same slots regardless of what their class is. They have helmet, they have amulet, they have body armor, they have 2 rings, they have a belt, they have gloves, they have boots, relic, a weapon, and an offhand if they're using a one-hander. They also have idle slots and blessings, which we will cover later, but just to give you a quick visual of what that looks like. Here's your body armor, helmet, weapon, offhand if you have it, necklace or amulet, rings, belt, boots, relic, gloves. These are all your idols, and then these are the blessings. Let's talk about how gear works as far as like what stats are on them, because you have all those items, but they're all going to have different kinds of stats and they're going to work in different ways. So let's specifically focus now on the gear that you wear traditionally in a character, which is your boots, your gloves, so on and so forth. So we'll skip the idols for now and the blessings. Come back to those later. So all that gear has a base type, which determines the type of the item, for example, gloves, boots, etc., and also gives it an implicit stat or stats. So again, going back to the live version, so this unique item has its body armor, its gladiator armor, and it has 220 armor as its implicit. This exalted helmet is of course, helmet for Sentinel. This one in particular is a winged helm, and that gives it 210 armor and 31% critical avoidance. And this is an amulet. It is a bone amulet with 36% physical resistance and 35% necrotic resistance. Now, those rolls oftentimes can have a range, and has a range of 13 to 40 on both resistances. This one has no range on the armor, but it does on critical strike avoidance. And then this one actually has no range whatsoever. It's always 220 armor. So as I just stated, a base will always have the same implicit types, but it will usually have a stat range. And of course, we saw there that there was a couple of stats that didn't. Armor tends to be relatively static over gear, but other things tend to have a different rule range. So keep track of that when you're looking at gear and trying to decide how good it is. Better bases drop at a higher area level, and they require higher character levels to equip. So that bone amulet, for example, is a really good base. It doesn't drop early in the game. You won't see that until sometime in the end game. Helmets, body armor, and relics are also class specific. There are some minor exceptions for relics, a few relics that can be worn universally, but they tend not to be very good, so most people don't wear them. All the rest of them are class specific. Uniques are also an exception to this. Uniques can be class specific and can also be not class specific. But if you're talking about just crafting items, we're talking about for example, the helmet I was wearing, this is always going to be Sentinel. It says right at the bottom right there, requires class Sentinel. Okay, let's talk about affixes. So we've went over the implicits. That's the stuff that rolls on the base item by itself. But you can have implicits on items. Implicits look like this. They're like the 4 dexterity, the echo damage with the skill echoes, the increased health, and the poison resistance. Those are all affixes. Uniques have their own affixes. We won't worry about those right now. This one here has increased damage while channeling, increased void damage, cold resistance, and chance to apply frailty on hit. Those are all the affixes that we're talking about, the kind of affixes. Every item can have up to 4 affixes, 2 prefixes, and 2 suffixes. Prefixes and suffixes will determine what you can actually put in that slot. Craftable items that you can put these affixes on are white, blue, yellow, and exalted. That's what we generally call them. Blue and yellow are technically rare. White is technically common, but I tend to go by white, blue, yellow, and exalted. Prefixes are usually offensive. So they're, or utility. So, you know, increase your damage in some way or another, or provide you with some sort of utility, like a cleanse of your, of ailments that are on you. And suffixes tend to be defensive, like health or resistances of some sort, or armor. Affixes have predefined gear slots. So a type of affix like vitality only fits in certain slots. Some fit in many, others only one. Vitality, as the example, goes in, I believe it can go in body armor, helmet, and gloves. But it can't go to anything else, whereas strength can go on just about every piece of armor. It can't go, or piece of armor. It can't go on weapons. And it can't go on some class-specific stuff that doesn't tend to use strength. But many more things than vitality. So what it can go on is just dependent upon what that affix is. Rarity plays a big part of it. There are class-specific affixes as well that will only go on gear that is class-specific itself. So not everything can be worn on every slot. There are also tiers to the items that you have, to the affixes you have on gear. They can range from tier 1 to tier 7, with tier 7 being the best, tier 1 being the worst. Most gear will only roll up to 5 tiers in any affix, but there is an exception, which is exalted items. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but exalted can roll the tier 6 or the tier 7. For non-exalteds, a 2 prefix and 2 suffix limitation on the system means that a maximum of 20 total tiers in any item. 5 tiers times 4 affixes. Now, there is a special exception that was just added this patch that can only be accessed via crafting, that allows you to put up to 24 by creating a 5th affix slot. But we'll cover that in the crafting lesson because it's a little bit out of the scope of this particular lesson. Let's talk about rarities. I mentioned the white, blue, yellow, purple. What does that actually mean in the game? White means it has no affixes on it whatsoever. Blue means it has 1 to 2 affixes. Yellow, 3 to 4. Those don't care what the tier is. They just care how many affixes are. So you could have 3 tier 5s or 3 tier 1s, and they're both considered yellow. Purple, though, does actually only care about the affix tier. It doesn't care how many are on it. So it could be a 1 tier 7, or it could be a tier 7 with 3 tier 3s. It will still be an exalted, no matter how many affixes it has. All it cares about is the tier level of one of the affixes being either tier 6 or tier 7. They're also uniques. I showed those off a little bit, and there's a new rarity tier called legendaries. We'll get into that a little bit here. Okay, let's go more of a deep dive into all of these rarities. So white, blue, yellow can all drop basically from level 1 onwards. They don't have any specific requirements. The affixed tier does matter here, though. Things with a lot of tiers will require a higher level to wear. So early, yellows will probably have only tier 1s or close to that on them, but they can still drop with 4 affix. All empty affix slots can also be crafted up. So if you have an item with 3 affixes, you can add another affix on it through the crafting system. We'll cover that in more detail during crafting, or the crafting lesson. Likelihood of item dropping with higher tiers does increase with the area level and the item rarity, as does the requirement for wearing that item. So as the area level you're in, it's not the character level. Be sure to recognize that difference. It depends on the difficulty of the content, not the level of the player. And also item rarity, which increases, which is a endgame mechanic. You can actually increase your item level percentage by several mechanics within the endgame. We'll cover that stuff also more in the endgame section. But so there are ways of improving what items drop in the world as you level your character and start doing endgame content. Crafting can also change the rarity of the items, because remember, rarity just means, outside of exalteds, how many affixes are taken up. So if you had a white item and you crafted on a tier 1 of some affix, it will become a blue item. If you had a 2 affix blue item and you crafted on an affix, you give it 3 affixes, it will now become a yellow item. So that's all that rarity means up to exalted. Once you get to exalted, we make that transition, but everything else, it is only telling you how many affixes are on the item. Now let's go into exalted, because that one is the exception. Tier 6 and tier 7 cannot be crafted, can only be found on exalteds, and if it is on an item, it becomes an exalted. Any non-exalted affixes, though, on an exalted item can still be crafted. So if you have a tier 7 on it and like a tier 2 You can craft that tier 2 up to 3, 4, 5, no higher. If it has open affix slots, you can craft on those as well. The only one you can't craft on is the Exalted itself. Tier 6 items, Exalteds, can drop from area level 55 and onward. And tier 7 drop from area level 90 onward. 55 also, coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, happens to be the start of the end game or the Monolith of Fate. So you generally won't find, although I think actually chapter 9 now does have 55, so it can drop Exalted, but most of the time you won't find Exalted items in the campaign. You will have to wait until you get to the end game or very close to it. And you can have multiple Exalted affixes on an item. It can drop with a tier 7 and a tier 6, or 3 tier 6s. All that's possible, although rare, and gets more rare the more affixes you have, up to the point to where I don't think anyone has legitimately dropped a 4 Exalted affix item in the world yet, even though the system has been in place for like a year. So that tells you just how rare it gets. But I've got plenty of 2 affix items and probably 1 or 2, 3. So they do happen, just not much. Exalteds also cannot be gambled. The only way to get these truly is in the world, fighting enemies and getting the rewards from doing so. Okay, uniques are similar to D3 legendaries or PoE uniques. Their affixes are predetermined, although they might have a rule range for the values of it. Let's take a look at one. So I've got a bunch of uniques actually on this build. This build is very unique heavy. Don't get the impression that we wear a bunch of uniques, because it's not quite right. But for this one in particular, the implicits can roll 50 to 100. The increased armor can roll 50 to 70. I got lucky on this one and got a perfect roll on that. Melee void damage can roll 5 to 10. And the increased melee damage can roll 50 to 70. But all of these affixes will always be on it. This Shattered Chains unique will always have increased armor, melee void damage, increased melee damage. Using a potion cleanses stun and freeze and stun immunity for 4 seconds when you use a potion. Those will always be on it, and those roll ranges will always be the case. Not all uniques also not all uniques have the same drop rate. Some are more rare than others, and some drop off certain bosses. So the end game bosses in particular have their own unique loot table. Think all of the Monolith of Fate bosses, like this, the typical ones. Don't worry about the nuance here. We'll get into this in the end game, but they all have, I think, 4 uniques that can drop off of them. And then other things are just random world drops. And some are more rare than others. Some you're more likely to get than others, and some you need to be a certain area level to even see drop. Okay, let's talk about legendaries now. Legendaries are the new system. This was just added a few days ago. Legendaries combine a unique with an exalted, basically, or affixes from an exalted. So what happens is uniques sometimes now drop with legendary potential, anywhere from +1 to +4. I'll actually show you what this looks like real quick, because I do have some. Let's just go over here. So a typical unique just looks like this, but then the ones with legendary potential have this extra thing right underneath the implicit. This one has 2 legendary potential, this one has 1 legendary potential. I don't think I have any in my inventory that are higher than 2 right now. Yep, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. They can go up to 4, although 4 is extremely unlikely, especially on certain items, but they can. And so what you do is you take one of those items with a legendary potential, one of those uniques, and you combine it in the Eternity Cache, which is in the new dungeon system. And it will take some of the affixes off of the Exalt. It's random which ones it chooses, and add them to the unique. Do I have an example of that I can easily show? This is like a brand new system, so I don't, it's worth looking. It's worth showing what this is like. So what affixes it takes off is completely random. You have to have 4 affixes on the Exalted. Don't worry too much about this stuff. There's other guides that are going to cover Legendary a lot more. Just understand how the system works at the basics, and then we can go from there. So let me pull up. Here we go. Yeah, McReven has actually got one. Got a +2 to a ring. So here's one. This is what it looks like when it becomes legendary. So the 2 red affixes are legendary. Those came off of an Exalted, went into the Eternity Cache in the dungeon, and because there's a +2 Sun Wreath, it pulled 2 of the 4 affixes off, and these are the 2 it pulled off. One of them good, one of them not so good. 7% cold resistance, not great, but still a pretty big power upgrade from the unique itself to have that kind of power taken off of an exalted item. Okay, and do again want to stress it requires an exalted with 4 affixes. Put that on. So if I were to try to put in, for example, let's just exalt Rarity cache, something like this, it wouldn't work because it only has 3 affixes. If you're trying to make yourself a legendary and you're noticing it's not working, check that. Also, the exalted has to be the same type as the unique. So if I were to try to make this, doesn't have any potential on it. If I were to try to make this into a legendary, I would have to use a relic. Any relic will do. An exalted relic will do. It has to be a relic. There's no relics in that one. There we go. So something like this would work. An amulet won't work. Has to be a relic to go with a relic. Okay, let's move on from the typical gear to some of the stuff that's a little bit more distinct in LE. Idols are the first big one. Now, idols, if you play D2, you'll have no problem grasping this because they're very similar to charms. Charms in D2 set in your inventory and give you some sort of statistical benefit, some sort of power bonus. The difference is, in Last Epoch, they have their own slot, so they actually go in here, and you unlock this section through the campaign, and eventually we'll unlock it to where it looks like this. And these are all idols. This is an idol, there's a 1x1, here's a 1x2 or 2x1. This is a 1x3 or 3x, I forget which way it goes. And these all fit in here, and you have to kind of play Tetris to make them all go in, so the choices you make are fairly strategic based upon how much space you have given the other idols you want to put in. They are random drops in the world, but they're not really target farmable. They're not craftable at all. You can target farm idol. I think there's idol. Yeah, there's idol echoes you can target farm, which is another endgame mechanic. But you can't specifically target. I want this kind of idol with this kind of a fix. You can't craft on it at all. There are blessings. There are some blessings that can improve your drop rate of certain kinds of idols, but overall, the system is meant to be pretty random, and you just maybe get lucky with an idol that fits your build, or maybe you don't. There are 2 unique idols, however, that are boss drops. Those ones you can target farm. You just kill the boss until you get the idol you want. Like I said, idol slots open through questing, through the campaign, so you just do the campaign, and ultimately it will open up, and the system will give you a progress meter on how close you are to having all your slots open. So here's 8 of 8, so that just tells you that I've got them all open. If you don't see 8 of 8, if you see something lower than that, then you've got more slots to open. Questing. Already talked about slotting idols like playing Tetris. Also, the 1x1 and 1x2 idols or 2x1 idols are universal. That means they can go on any class. So in this particular build, these here, and these here are all universal. I could take these out and put these in a Sentinel or put these in a Primalist. These, however, are mage specific. They only go on mage. I cannot put these on a Sentinel. Okay, blessings. I think this is our last section. Blessings are earned through the Model of Fate, another endgame system reference. So a lot of stuff it really opens up the endgame section of Last Epoch. Which is why you're probably going to want to spend some time in there. And we'll be doing another endgame part of the university here real soon. Each Monolith of Fate boss has their own blessing table. Oh, not to get too detailed into the endgame, because again, I really want to save that and don't want to confuse you, but basically the endgame that we're talking about here is this system where there's these bunch of islands. You go in this island, you do a bunch of stuff, you progress the island, and eventually you will open up a boss fight, and when you kill the boss, you will be rewarded with some choices for blessings. That's where this system comes into play. Each boss will have their own table of blessings, and you can only have 1 blessing from each boss at a time, but you can change it later if you'd like to. And you can target farm a boss to acquire the blessing that you like, or the role within that blessing, because blessings do have their own role range. See the roll range they have here. So this one particular here, I've got 35% critical strike multiplier. If I press Alt, I can see that that's 35 with a maximum of 40. So it ranges anywhere from 27 to 40. So a pretty good roll, but not perfect. If I wanted to, I could make that roll better by farming that boss and hopefully getting the blessing at a higher roll range. Blessings can be character power or utility. So each boss is one or the other. A boss that is a character power blessing boss will always only have that, and bosses that only have utility will only be that. And examples of utility are increased gold drop, increased XP, more of a particular idol type dropping in the world, increased chances of uniques, increased chances of shards on body armor, that sort of thing. There's a whole bunch of them, so there's a lot to look up if you're interested. Blessings are permanent improvements to the character. They don't just work inside the Monolith of Fate or inside that particular island you're on. They work everywhere in the world. Once you have a blessing on your character, it's always there until you change it to something else. As I mentioned, blessings have a roll range. Higher quality blessings can be acquired in the empowered Monolith of Fate. So there's the standard Monolith of Fate, which will have lower blessing ranges of the same blessing types. Then if you get to the empowered, which is the harder content, you can actually get a better blessing roll on that of that type. But again, we'll go through this stuff in even more detail in the end game lesson. Okay, here's actually the last section. Let's talk about, no, actually there's two more, aren't there? Yeah, there's two more. Vendors and gambling. So there are vendors in the world where you can purchase gear, and they update about every 15 minutes. Or you can force an update by logging out and back in if you want to. The items are weighted towards level appropriate bases, so you will tend to see stuff that's around your level range. Fewer things that are not lower than your level. It does not sell uniques, exalted, or idols, so you can only get craftables, and not even exalted craftables, just yellow or below. And the purchases are made with gold. The gambler also exists, and purchases are made with gold. The items display the base type, but not the implicit rolls or any of the affixes on it. And they must be purchased to know the true value of them. You cannot roll exalted or uniques, just like the vendors. And but you can re-roll the gambler's inventory for 500 gold, or less at lower levels, so if you want to see more of what it has to offer. It tends to be expensive, but it is an option for targeting a specific base or rare affix. The gambler every patch does become less and less valuable. In this patch, that's also been the case because both the gambler and the vendor items roll with lower forging potential than roll drops. Forging potential is a very important crafting stat. And having a lower forging potential means you'll probably have worse crafting outcomes. We'll cover that again. That's another one of those things we'll cover in another lesson, specifically the crafting one. So don't worry too much about the gambler. You actually can go the entire game now without dealing with a gambler. But if you do have like a hole in your gear and you'd like to try to fill it up, especially during the campaign, then a gambler can be a pretty good option for that. Okay, last thing, item rarity and target farming. So we're trying to get gear. It's probably good to know how you can improve the chances of getting good gear. And so these are two ways you can do that. So item rarity is an endgame mechanic that increases the chance to find higher tiers and more fixed and craftable items, exalted items, unique items, crafting mats, and keys. We'll go through this more during the Monolith of Fate lesson and the endgame lessons. But know that if you would like to improve the ability to get better gear, once you get to the end of time, start looking at item rarity. Or not to the end of time, to the Monolith of Fate. Start looking at item rarity. It will only start then. It will not start in the campaign. You don't have to worry about there at all. But once you get to there, to the Monolith of Fate, that's when it starts to become something that can improve the chances of getting good gear. You can also target farm certain things. So if you're looking for a particular unique, do check and see if that unique drops off of a certain boss, or if it doesn't drop off a boss but it drops in the world. There are ways to target farm it through the Monolith of Fate reward system. You can target farm specific rare affixes, not affixes, excuse me, rare bases, exalted bases, and unique types. So for example, there are rewards in the Monolith of Fate that maybe give you, this drops a unique ring, or this drops a unique two-handed sword, or this drops exalted relics. That sort of stuff exists when you get to the end game, so keep an eye out for it. Another new thing that was added for target farming is a thing called the Rune of Ascension. This is through the crafting system. The Rune of Ascension is a very simple crafting mechanic, even though it is quite rare to get. You take a base item like a ring, any kind of ring, you put it into the crafter, you put in a rune of ascension, it turns that ring into a unique ring, one of the uniques in the table. It will choose semi-random depending on rarity. So this is a way of target farming. Say if you needed a particular unique ring, you can use the Rune of Ascension to give you more unique drops just by crafting them. For more info, again, see Lesson 11 Endgame, where we will cover this in greater detail. All right, that should be everything for this lesson. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to join us as we play Last Epoch a lot, especially right now, would love to have you in Twitch and in our chat. We also have a Discord where the community is quite lively and very happy to answer any questions that you may have. All right, thanks again for watching. Enjoy your time in Last Epoch, and I will see you all again real soon.